Tucked between a still lake and whispering pines, I thought I'd found the perfect sanctuary for an audio producer until an unexpected letter shattered that illusion. It came from someone I'd never met, Stephanie Wilcox, a blonde whirlwind, who'd crowned herself ruler of a neighborhood I never agreed to join. With that single envelope, she fired the opening shot in a battle she couldn't have predicted. What started as nuisance complaints soon spiraled into a clash over legal lines, personal space, and long-buried truths. Think you know what it means to own land? By the time this story ends, you might be double-checking your property lines and investing in a discreet recording device. I'm Derek Whitman, and 3 years ago, I inherited this cabin from my grandfather. 40 wooded acres in Michigan, untouched by time, surrounded by a lakefront subdivision that popped up about a decade ago. I'm a sound designer, mostly working with indie filmmakers, and after getting chewed up by a brutal business lawsuit, I came here to heal. There was something poetic about a man whose life revolved around sound, seeking refuge in silence. The morning it all unraveled began like any other. I was putting the final touches on a film score when I heard the familiar grind of tires on gravel, the mail truck. I grabbed the usual stack of bills, but one envelope stood out clean, white, and foreboding. The return address, Pine Lake Heights HOA. The label, urgent violation. My stomach sank. I'd never signed anything with that association. My land, recorded in county records since the 1960s, had nothing to do with the lakeside development next door. But there it was, addressed directly to me. Inside, a single sheet demanded immediate contact regarding excessive noise and unpermitted business activity. The fine started at $75 and climbed from there. At the bottom, a bold, cursive signature, Stephanie Wilcox, HOA President. I reread it, puzzled. Noise violations? I worked with headphones. Commercial activity? A handful of clients maybe, and my driveway wasn't even connected to their roads. Something didn't add up. I called the number listed, hoping this was all a clerical mix-up. A woman answered, crisp and overly cheerful in a way that immediately felt staged. Pine Lake Heights HOA, Stephanie Wilcox speaking. How can I help maintain community harmony today? I kept my tone even. Hi, this is Derek Whitman. I got a letter about violations, but I think there's been some confusion. My land isn't part of your HOA. It's private and predates your community. There was a beat of silence. Then the sugar in her voice soured. Mr. Whitman, I'm fully aware of your circumstances. Your land may be exempt from membership dues, but it's still within our broader community zone. We all have to do our part, and frankly, your creative work isn't aligned with the family-friendly, high-value vision we've built. I clenched my jaw but stayed composed. Ma'am, with all due respect, I own this land. I'm not subject to your rules, and I haven't broken any actual laws. Maybe we could discuss this in person. She laughed, sharp and cold. Oh, Mr. Whitman, being a neighbor means more than hiding behind technicalities. I suggest you reconsider joining us voluntarily. It would save us all a lot of trouble. Then she hung up. I stared at the phone in stunned silence. That night, I sat on the porch staring at the glassy water, the last light of dusk turning the lake violet. Her words echoed in my head, no one lives as an island. I looked out at the peninsula I called home and almost laughed. If I wasn't an island, I was as close as anyone could be. I'd come here for solitude, for creative freedom. But to Stephanie, I was an obstacle, a blemish on her perfect little map. As I stepped inside, I glanced at the blinking light on my studio setup. The automatic recorder had picked up the call. Good. In my world, backups are everything. Something told me I'd be relying on that system more than ever. The quiet music producer just trying to be left alone had unknowingly entered a new genre. Legal thriller. 3 days later, another envelope arrived, this one thicker and far less polite. It was a formal violation packet with a bold red total, $750 due. The breakdown was almost laughable. Operating a recording studio without approval, $250. Disturbing the peace, $200. Unauthorized commercial activity, $300. Each fee supposedly based on projected impacts to community property values. A note in red demanded payment within 7 days. Clipped to the bundle was a letter from Dennis Keene, attorney at law, written on intentionally intimidating letterhead. Dear Mr. Whitman, it began, I represent Pine Lake Heights HOA regarding enforcement of community standards. Your continued non-compliance is a legal matter that may result in court proceedings and additional penalties. The letter rattled off threats, liens, lawsuits, forced compliance, legal fees. 2 full pages of legalese clearly designed to scare someone into writing a check. And for a split second, I almost did. My first reaction was pure panic. The trauma of my last legal war surged back like a tidal wave. But I forced myself to stay calm and think logically. I spent the next several hours combing through Michigan state property laws and HOA statutes. What I found was a relief. Homeowners. Associations only have authority over properties that opted in through deed covenants or purchase contracts. Mine had neither. My grandfather's deed, untouched since the 1960s, had no mention of an HONO legal hooks. Legally, they had as much power over me as a neighborhood book club. I decided to talk to someone nearby who might have insight. There was a woman I occasionally saw walking her dog by the public lake access. She'd always smiled and waved. The next morning, I spotted her helping her daughter with schoolwork at the park near the boat launch. Hi, I'm Derek Whitman, I said. I live up the peninsula. Could I ask you something about the HOA here? Her face shifted instantly to a mix of sympathy and frustration. Oh no, you got the Stephanie treatment, didn't you? I'm Susan Holloway. Unfortunately, I know exactly what you're dealing with. Susan's story was both enlightening and infuriating. She'd moved to Pine Lake Heights 4 years ago, attracted by the scenic surroundings and the promise of peace. At first, the HOA was benign, run by a retired schoolteacher who mostly handled trash pickup and path maintenance. Then Stephanie Wilcox arrived. She used her divorce settlement to buy the largest lakefront home, and within months, she launched a campaign to raise the neighborhood's profile. In 6 months, she maneuvered her way into the HOA presidency. That's when things changed. Susan gestured to her 12-year-old daughter. Emma got fined $50 last month for drawing chalk art on our own sidewalk. Stephanie labeled it graffiti. As Susan talked, a pattern emerged. Stephanie had been targeting anyone who didn't align with her polished, upscale vision. A retired man with chickens was fined into moving out. A couple fixing up their old truck got violation after violation until they gave up and sold. And she had a particular disdain for freelancers, artists, and remote workers. She thinks we make the place look cheap, Susan said bitterly. I felt a chill. This wasn't about community harmony. It was about enforcing a narrow fantasy of who belongs. That evening, Stephanie called again. This time, the sugary tone was gone, her voice rigid, charged with aggression. Mr. Whitman, I trust you've read Mr. Keene's letter. I hope you understand how seriously we take our community values. This isn't just about you, it's about protecting the investments of 23 families who chose to live somewhere peaceful and refined. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice calm. Ms. Wilcox, I've done my research. Your HOA has no legal authority over my land. I've never joined. My property predates your community. I won't be paying these fines. Her laugh was low and cold. Oh, Mr. Whitman, you'll find legal technicalities don't mean much in the real world. There are many ways to encourage cooperation. I intend to explore them. I ended the call and sat in silence, surrounded by the audio. gear that had been my refuge for 3 years. But now, that safety felt compromised, vulnerable. I looked at my equipment and remembered something important. I had tools most people didn't. I reactivated my full recording setup for every call and interaction. If Stephanie wanted a fight, she was about to learn the downside of picking on someone who records everything with professional precision. Stephanie had just declared war on someone who made his living capturing voices, details, and hidden subtext. She had no idea the level of documentation I could bring to bear. A week after that second call, the real harassment began. My internet suddenly became spotty. Service reps blamed excessive business usage on a residential line, citing a complaint from a concerned local resident. It was too well-timed to be a coincidence. Then my mail started showing up late or not at all. When I asked the postal worker, he said someone had reported my gravel driveway as unsafe to access, even though it had been unchanged for decades. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning. I spotted Stephanie and an unfamiliar man at the edge of my property, taking pictures of my cabin and studio. I grabbed my portable recorder and walked down the path, stopping just inside my side of the property line. "Morning. Can I help you?" I asked. Stephanie wore her usual look bright, overpriced activewear that screamed curated wealth. The man beside her looked like a dollar store lawyer, cheap suit, battered briefcase, and a forced sense of authority. "Mr. Whitman," she began, "this is Dennis Keene, our attorney. We're conducting an inspection of documented violations." My pulse sped up, but I stayed composed. "You're free to look from the public road, but this is private property. You don't have permission to enter." Dennis stepped forward, trying to look important. "Actually, under Michigan Statute 299-67, OA boards can inspect for code violations with reasonable suspicion." I nearly laughed. "That statute only applies to properties within the HOA. Mine isn't, and even if it did, you'd need a court order to step onto private land uninvited." The look they exchanged told me everything. They were bluffing and didn't expect me to call it. I held up my phone and made sure they saw the red recording light. "What you're doing, Mal, that's bordering on trespassing. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Stephanie's composure cracked, just for a second. I caught a flash of something raw and ugly behind her eyes. "This isn't over, Mr. Whitman. There are many ways to encourage community cooperation. Legal action is just one of them." They turned and walked off, Dennis theatrically scribbling into a notebook like he was building some grand legal case. That afternoon, my phone rang. It was the Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy. Someone had filed a complaint about an illegal recording studio, possibly violating wetland protection regulations. The complaint accused me of sound pollution affecting local wildlife and chemical waste, contaminating the groundwater. Both claims were laughable, but not to the state. I spent 3 hours on the phone, bouncing between departments, submitting documentation, and trying to explain that I wasn't dumping toxic waste, I was mixing podcasts. The stress brought back memories I'd buried deep, endless calls, form, letters, legal jargon meant to confuse and intimidate. I reminded myself I had the truth on my side. But then I checked my security system. Someone had accessed it remotely. Several days of footage were gone right around the time Stephanie and Dennis had been skulking around my property. Luckily, I had backups, redundant, offline backups. Years of paranoia turned out to be worth it. I watched, jaw clenched, as my recovered files showed them measuring my buildings, snapping photos, and Dennis on the phone while pointing at my cabin. I felt that familiar pulse of anxiety rise, but this time, panic didn't follow. What settled into my chest instead was something colder, heavier. This wasn't neighborhood bickering anymore. This was stalking, invasion, targeted interference with my livelihood and personal life. And it was time to fight back. Susan had told me, "Stephanie, Usually got her way because people gave up. They sold, packed, and moved on. But not me. I'd already lost once to intimidation and a rigged system. Not again. Not now. I had evidence. I had time. I had nothing left to lose. That night I made a decision. No more reacting. From that moment on, I would build a full legal and digital case against Stephanie Wilcox and her HOA. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter. My hands trembled as I opened it. Dennis Keene had filed a lawsuit. The claim? That I was operating a nuisance property, harming the value, peace, and aesthetics of Pine Lake Heights. They were demanding $15,000 in damages. But the real gut punch came in the attachments. An application for property annexation filed with the county bearing what looked like my signature. A request to incorporate my land into the HOA. The date on the form? 3 weeks ago, around the time of Stephanie's first call. I stared at the signature for a long time. It looked close. Like me, but not quite. And I never signed any such request. Someone either forged my name or tricked me into signing something under false pretenses. Forgery in Michigan isn't a slap on the wrist, it's a felony. 14 years, if proven. If I could trace this back to them, this wasn't just civil harassment anymore, this was criminal. Before I could fully absorb what that meant, my phone rang again. Unknown number. A deep, polished voice answered my hello. Mr. Whitman, this is Richard Baxter with the County Commissioner's Office. I understand there's been some confusion about your property status and zoning compliance. I'm calling as a courtesy to give you a chance to address certain concerns before they become more serious. His tone was friendly, almost warm. But beneath it was something unmistakable, a warning. Commissioner Baxter, I said, keeping my tone measured. I'm not aware of any zoning violations. My land's been in compliance for over 50 years. He chuckled. It wasn't friendly. Well, Mr. Whitman, times change. What was acceptable in the past doesn't always align with current community standards. The Pine Lake area is very desirable now, and we all have a responsibility to maintain that growth. I hung up and immediately started digging. Baxter's campaign finance reports showed a $5,000 donation from Wilcox Properties LL Bill Cox's real estate company. The next week was a coordinated campaign of pressure, inspections, visits, a county building inspector, the fire marshal, the health department, all responding to anonymous complaints. Every inspection found nothing. But that wasn't the point. The message was clear. They could drag me through bureaucratic hell forever. I missed 2 deadlines. Lost a client. My bank account was shrinking, and I was staring down a choice no one should have to make: hire a lawyer I couldn't afford, or surrender the life I'd fought to build. Then Susan knocked on my door. Pale, nervous, eyes darting like she was afraid to be seen. "Derek," she said, "I found something. You need to see this." She handed me a folder copies of financial records from the treasurer's office. "I've been looking into the HOS finances. There are irregularities." I flipped through bank statements, expense reports, grant applications. She pointed to one form. "This is a federal community development grant they got last year. $25,000, approved for infrastructure in underserved rural communities. Look at the address." I did. My stomach dropped. 102 Pine Lake Road, my address. The application described a struggling rural community, low-income families, lack of road access, failing utilities. It was fiction, and it used my land as the central location. "Susan," I said slowly, "this is federal fraud. They used my property to obtain government funds under false pretenses." She nodded. "It gets worse. Look where the money went." The paper trail showed every dollar. Landscaping at the HOA clubhouse, new leather furniture, community outreach payments directly to Stephanie Wilcox. That night, I sat alone in my studio, surrounded by piles of evidence that felt like pieces of a larger puzzle. I had proof of harassment, forged signatures, federal grant fraud, and links to corrupt officials. But more than that, I had hundreds of hours of recorded calls, video clips, and a detailed timeline exposing a web of criminal collusion. They had seriously underestimated who they were dealing with. I wasn't some isolated recluse to scare away. I was a professional trained to capture every detail with precision, equipped with the patience and skills to build an unbreakable case. As I sorted the evidence into files, it hit me. Stephanie Wilcox's biggest error wasn't underestimating me. It was leaving such an obvious digital footprint. The next battle would be fought on my ground, with my tools, and under the full weight of federal law. The following morning, I resolved to build a case so thorough it would end the harassment for good. My first step was to call James Morrison, a surveyor experienced in boundary disputes. When he arrived with his advanced equipment, I felt hope return after months of uncertainty. "Mr. Whitman," he said after his initial review, "your property lines are exactly where you believe. But there's a bigger problem. The clubhouse they built encroaches on your land by about 15%. That statement hit me like a punch. A surge of vindication and fury made my hands shake. For months, they'd painted me as the troublemaker. Now I held clear proof that they were the lawbreakers. James' report was meticulous and damning. The Pine Lake Heights HOA clubhouse, built just 2 years ago for $60,000, sat partially on my property, covering the north wing, parking lot, and half of the landscaped entry. I walked the boundary with him, seeing the stakes marking the intrusion. "This wasn't an accident," James said. "They knew exactly where the line was, but built anyway." With commercial land rents around $3,000 per acre annually, they owed me at least $6,000 plus ongoing fees for their 2 years of trespass. But more than money, this was about blatant arrogance, people who believed they could take whatever they wanted from someone they saw as powerless. Susan connected me with Tommy Brooks, a 28-year-old IT expert in the development who despised Stephanie's iron grip. Tommy had been quietly monitoring HOA digital activity for months. "Derek, what they're doing to you is part of a bigger pattern harassment and financial abuse." He handed me a flash drive. "This contains every email, financial record, and document from the past 18 months. Inside were damning files, emails between Stephanie and Dennis plotting pressure tactics, financials revealing HOA fund misuse, and audio recordings from board meetings. The recordings were the most revealing. In one, Stephanie coldly plotted, "The music producer is our biggest hurdle. If we can force him out, his land would be perfect for phase 2. Dennis thinks if we make life hard enough, he'll sell cheap." Another clip had her laughing over the grant fraud. Using the hermit's address was genius. He's too isolated to catch on. With this arsenal, I reached out to Stephanie's past victims. The first was Harold Morrison, 73, forced to abandon his chickens. He lived in a cramped apartment above his daughter's garage. "Mr. Whitman," he said, voice trembling, "those birds were more than livestock, they were my family. After my wife died, Stephanie crushed me with fines and threats. I spent my last $3,000 fighting her and still lost." Tears welled as he continued. "She said my chickens hurt property values, but I was here first." Next, I visited Marcus and Jennifer Chun, a young couple forced out after harassment over working on their car. "That house was our dream," Jennifer said bitterly. "Marcus is a mechanic, and we were restoring a Mustang together. Then the violations came. Unauthorized repairs, commercial use in a residential zone, visual blight. Each time Marcus opened the hood, they fined us $200. Marcus nodded grimly. "We couldn't afford the legal fees, so we sold for $38,000 less just to escape the stress. Now we're renting, and owning feels impossible." The pattern was clear and heartbreaking. Stephanie systematically destroyed lives and dreams to mold the neighborhood to her vision. But my biggest advantage came from my own habits. As a producer obsessed with audio quality and backups, I've been recording all calls for 2 years, including every threatening call from Stephanie, Dennis, and even courtesy warnings from Commissioner Baxter. Under Michigan's single-party consent law, these recordings were legal evidence. The most chilling was Stephanie's second call. There are many ways to encourage good neighborly behavior, and I'm prepared to explore all of them. With the full context, it sounded less like a neighborly warning and more like a cold threat. Combined with documented harassment, federal fraud, signature forgery, and property trespassing, I had enough evidence to not only end Stephanie's HOA presidency, but potentially send her to jail. A quick check with the Michigan Bar Association explained why Dennis Keene's legal threats sounded so generic. Though licensed, he specialized in real estate deals, not courtroom litigation. He'd never actually tried a case, never handled harassment suits, and had no expertise in complex property law. His threatening letters were basically form letters filled with vague, intimidating language meant to scare those who lacked legal savvy. As I organized the evidence into a thorough legal filing, I thought back to my grandfather's advice about keeping good records, never more relevant than now. But it wasn't just about my property or peace anymore. Harold Morrison's tears, the Chun's broken dreams, Susan's daughter fined for chalk art. This was about a community terrorized by someone who weaponized the law. Stephanie Wilcox had declared war on the wrong person, someone whose entire career depended on documentation, preservation, and precision. She was about to discover why that was her biggest mistake, not just for her, but for everyone she'd hurt. The turning point came unexpectedly. Tommy showed up 3 days before my lawsuit filing, nervous and holding a flash drive. "Derek, I need to show you this." Last week's emergency HOA board meeting was revealing. He'd secretly recorded it. The 47-minute audio made it clear the war was over. Stephanie hadn't just admitted what I suspected. She revealed crimes and schemes beyond my imagination. Her voice on the recording was clear and unguarded as she spoke to the board. "The Whitman problem needs a permanent solution. I'm in talks with a developer interested in the entire peninsula for a luxury resort. If we force him out, the land's value will fund our expansion for years." She described systematically targeting residents to acquire their properties. The Chicken Man sold for $60,000 below market after their pressure. The couple with the car hobby lost nearly $40,000 on their forced sale. Every family pushed out sold at a loss, and she already had buyers lined up. The most damaging part was her casual talk of forged signatures and deals with Commissioner Baxter. "Richard's been invaluable with zoning issues. His fees are worth it. Any annexations will be fast-tracked, signed or not. Whitman's annexation will be approved in 2 weeks." This wasn't just conspiracy, it was local government corruption and abuse of federal aid programs designed to help struggling communities. Armed with this audio, I launched a coordinated legal assault on multiple fronts. A federal criminal complaint to the FBI for grant, wire, and mail fraud. A complaint to the Michigan Attorney General about forgery and corruption. And a civil lawsuit for harassment, defamation, fraud, and civil rights violations. The preliminary hearing was set for Friday, and I chose to represent myself. After my previous legal disaster, I'd studied law extensively, partly out of necessity, partly determination to never be caught off guard again. When I entered the courtroom carrying 3 boxes of evidence and my audio setup, I felt more confident than I had in months. The room was small but formal, with high ceilings and dark wood paneling that absorbed sound. I methodically set up my gear, checking levels with the same care I used in my studio. Stephanie arrived 15 minutes late, a power move that backfired. She strode in wearing a bright pink suit designed to command attention, her blonde hair flawless and makeup perfect. But there was a subtle tension around her eyes, less confidence than usual. Dennis Keene followed, carrying his briefcase and wearing the same ill-fitting suit from their property inspection. Both clearly expected an easy intimidation session to make me settle quietly. Judge Patricia Hamilton was in her 50s, with steel gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she'd seen every trick in the book. She listened to my presentation with growing disbelief and anger, her expression shifting from neutral to barely contained outrage as I laid out the evidence. When I played Stephanie's recorded confession about the Whitman issue, her eyebrows rose sharply. The federal grant fraud clip made her lean forward. By the time I reached the forged signatures, Judge Hamilton was visibly struggling to maintain composure. "Miss Wilcox," the judge said coldly when I finished, "are you seriously telling this court that you've been running a criminal enterprise disguised as a homeowners association?" Stephanie's mask cracked. Her face flushed, deep red, clashing with her pink suit as she stammered about community standards and property values. Dennis tried to object, claiming the recordings were illegally obtained, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept glancing at Stephanie, hoping she'd save him. I was ready with Michigan's single-party consent law and precedent cases. Every recording was legal, every document properly obtained, and every claim backed by multiple evidences. When Dennis challenged the audio's admissibility, Judge Hamilton cut him off with a look that could freeze fire. "Counselor, are you suggesting your client didn't say these things? If authentic, and they sound authentic, this is admitted criminal conduct far beyond this civil hearing." Dennis went pale and shrank in his suit. Clearly, this wasn't the type of case he was prepared for. The judge's ruling was swift. She issued a restraining order barring the HOA from any contact with me or actions involving my property. She ordered the clubhouse removed from my land within 90 days or face contempt charges. Most importantly, she referred the case to federal prosecutors and demanded an immediate investigation into Commissioner Baxter. "This court rarely sees such a pattern of harassment, fraud, and corruption," she declared. "The evidence indicates criminal activity far beyond a simple property dispute." Outside the courtroom, Stephanie's transformation was complete. The once confident woman who had terrorized the community now looked panicked and defeated. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, makeup smeared by nervous sweat, and her hands shook as she whispered frantic plans to Dennis about appeals and damage control. But it was too late. The audio bomb had exploded, and the fallout would destroy everything she'd built on lies. Dennis looked like a man who just realized he'd been bluffing in a game everyone else saw was rigged. The briefcase that had once seemed like a prop now weighed him down as he shuffled out of the courthouse. His legal career was effectively over. That evening, I sat on my deck watching the sunset over the lake, feeling truly peaceful for the first time in months. The loons called across the water, and the only human sounds were distant children playing at the public beach. My phone buzzed. A text from Susan. "Emergency HOA meeting tonight." Word was spreading fast. People were finally talking. I smiled, knowing the silence of intimidation was breaking. The community that had been terrorized into submission was about to find its voice again. Stephanie Wilcox's final desperate gambit came exactly 1 week after the court hearing, and it was so spectacularly misguided it almost felt like she was trying to destroy herself. Instead of accepting defeat quietly, she launched a public relations offensive. She contacted Channel 7 News in Grand Rapids, claiming she was the victim of harassment by an unstable hermit intent on destroying a peaceful community organization. The reporter, Jennifer Walsh, initially seemed intrigued by the story of a small lakeside community under siege by an antisocial property owner, refusing to follow neighborhood standards. But Jennifer was a real journalist, not the local media puppet Stephanie expected. When she dug into the story's background, she uncovered federal criminal complaints, court filings, and documented evidence of HOA corruption, all public record. More importantly, she listened to the audio recording submitted as court evidence. 3 days later, Channel 7 aired a devastating story titled Hellhomer Society Became a Criminal Enterprise. It featured interviews with Stephanie's victims, expert analysis of financial fraud, and audio clips of Stephanie detailing her schemes to force residents from their homes. The media attention triggered a cascade of consequences. The Michigan Attorney General announced a comprehensive statewide investigation into HOA abuses, using Pine Lake Heights as the primary example. The FBI raided Stephanie's home in Dennis. Keene's law office, seizing computers, financial records, and communications related to federal grant fraud. Commissioner Baxter resigned and entered a plea agreement with prosecutors in exchange for cooperation. The speed and scope of the collapse were breathtaking. What began as a property dispute had exposed a web of corruption reaching multiple levels of government. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the Pine Lake community itself. For 2 years, Stephanie's reign of terror had created fear and mistrust. Neighbors stopped talking, afraid conversations might be reported. Children played quietly indoors rather than risk noise citations. The community center sat empty, residents too frightened to gather. Now, with Stephanie's power broken, people emerged from isolation like flowers after a long winter. Susan organized the first community meeting in 2 years, and nearly every resident attended. The gathering was held in the old community center, a modest building neglected during Stephanie's rule, since she planned to replace it with something upscale. Harold Morrison, the elderly man who'd lost his chickens, stood to speak for the first time since being forced from his home. "I want to thank Derek Whitman for what he did," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard before. "But more than that, I want to apologize for not speaking up sooner. We let fear divide us, and that gave someone like Stephanie power over our lives." Marcus and Jennifer Chun shared their experience, and others began telling stories of harassment and intimidation. The most satisfying moment came when the construction crew arrived to demolish the clubhouse portion sitting on my property. Small crowd gathered, and I noticed something I hadn't seen in months. People smiling, talking, acting like neighbors again. As the crew broke ground, they uncovered something unexpected, a hidden floor safe beneath the building. It required a court order to open, but inside was over $40,000 in cash and detailed financial records, showing Stephanie had been systematically skimming HOA funds, federal grants, and community improvement money. The discovery provided prosecutors the final evidence to file felony embezzlement charges. Justice came faster than expected. Faced with overwhelming evidence and federal charges, Stephanie agreed to a plea bargain: 18 months in federal prison, full restitution of stolen funds, and forfeiture of all property acquired through fraud. Dennis Keene lost his law license and received 2 years probation for cooperation. Commissioner Baxter was sentenced to community service and barred from public office for 10 years. The HOA was dissolved by court order, with assets distributed among victims. The financial settlement was more generous than I imagined. The court ordered $25,000 for unauthorized use of my land, plus legal expenses and harassment damages. Federal restitution compensated for fraudulent use of my identity in grant applications. But the money wasn't what mattered most. What mattered was seeing Harold Morrison return to his property with a small flock of chickens, watching the Chun family buy back their dream home at a fair price, and witnessing a community rediscover its voice after years of enforced silence. The real surprise was my own reaction to victory. For months, I'd been focused on winning, proving my case, and ensuring Stephanie and her accomplices faced consequences. But sitting in my studio after the final hearing, I realized something had changed in me. The fight had restored my confidence, not just in standing up for myself, but for others. I was no longer the traumatized hermit hiding in the woods. I was someone who could confront corruption and bullying with intelligence, patience, and the right tools. That realization led to a decision that surprised everyone, including me. Instead of returning to my quiet life as a music producer, I used the settlement and newfound confidence to build something lasting and positive. I contacted the Pine Lake Conservation Trust and arranged to donate most of my property to be preserved as a nature sanctuary, keeping only the cabin and immediate grounds for personal use. The Pine Lake Nature Preserve would protect the peninsula's ecosystem forever, preventing any future developer from turning this peaceful refuge into a commercial project. Using my technical skills and investigative know-how from the legal battle, I established the Community Defense Network, a nonprofit, helping property owners and small communities fight HOA abuse, municipal corruption, and predatory development. Tommy became our technical director. Susan managed finances. Within 6 months, we were assisting communities across 3 states in documenting and fighting organized intimidation. Harold Morrison became our first volunteer, sharing his story. To help other seniors facing harassment, the Chuns contributed their experience to educate young families about their rights against abusive HOAs. 6 months after Stephanie's sentencing, Jennifer Walsh reached out again, working on a follow-up about the long-term impact of the Pine Lake Heights case. As I prepared for that interview, sitting on my deck overlooking the now partly protected lake, I realized how much had changed since that first threatening letter. The community, once divided by fear, was now united around conservation and mutual support. Children played freely in the streets. Neighbors gathered for barbecues and block parties. The community center hummed with book clubs, environmental programs, and renewed life. The lake was still peaceful, the loon still called at sunset, and my studio remained a sanctuary for creativity. But I was no longer isolated or afraid, not running from conflict anymore. Stephanie Wilcox tried to destroy my peaceful life. Instead, she gave me something I hadn't known I was missing: a sense of purpose, a community of allies, and the knowledge that sometimes protecting your peace means fighting for justice far beyond your own doorstep. The woman who tried to make me homeless had inadvertently helped me find my true home, not just a place, but a cause that mattered to everyone who believes bullies shouldn't win. And communities can heal when good people find the courage to stand together.